Hey guys, it's Trevor here with Reading Time with Parker and Trevor. So today we're going to be reading Hatchet again by Gary Paulson. So if you missed our chapter 9, it was a pretty exciting chapter. Brian actually figured out how to start his fire. As we talked about in chapter 8, he figured out that he could make fire, and in chapter 9 he actually figured out how to make the fire. So at this point in going into chapter 10, he has made his fire, figured out what he has to do. He had some troubles with it at first, but once you read through that chapter and listen to it, he figured it out. So he has his fire made now, so in chapter 10 we're going to talk about what he does with it. He could not at first leave the fire. It was so precious to him, so close and sweet a thing, the yellow and red flames brightening the dark interior of the shelter, the happy crackle of the dry wood as it burned, that he could not leave it. He went to the trees and brought in as many dead limbs as he could chop off and carry, and when he had a large pile of them, he sat near the fire. Though it was getting into the warm middle part of the day, he was hot, and broke them in small pieces and fed the fire. "I will not let you go out," he said to himself, to the flames, "not ever." And so he sat through a long part of the day, keeping the flames even, eating his stock of raspberries, leaving to drink from the lake when he was thirsty. In the afternoon, toward evening, with his face smoke smeared and his skin red from the heat, he finally began to think ahead of what he needed to do. He would need a large wood pile to get through the night. It would be almost impossible to find wood in the dark, so he had to have it all in and cut and stacked before the sun went down. Brian made certain that the fire was banked with new wood, then went out of the shelter and searched for a good fuel supply. Up the hill from the campsite, the same windstorm that left him in a place to land the plane had only been there 3-4 days ago, had dropped three large white pines across each other. They were dead now, dry and filled with weathered, dry, dead limbs, even enough for many days. He chopped and broke and carried wood back to the camp, stacking the pieces under the overhang until he had what he thought to be an enormous pile, as his head and 6 feet across the base. Between trips, he added small pieces to the fire to keep it going, and one of the trips to get wood, he noticed an added advantage of the fire. When he was in the shade of the trees breaking limbs, the mosquitoes swarmed on him, as usual. But when he came to the fire, or just near the shelter where the smoke eddied and swirled, the insects were gone. It was a wonderful discovery. The mosquitoes had nearly driven him mad, and the thought of being rid of them lifted his spirits. On another trip, he looked back and saw smoke curling up through the trees and realized for the first time that he had a means to make a signal. He could carry a burning stick to build a signal fire on top of the rock, make clouds of smoke and perhaps attract attention, which meant more wood and still more wood and still more wood. There did not seem to be an end of the wood he would need, and he spent all the rest of the afternoon into dusk making wood trips. At dark, he settled in again for the night next to the fire with a stack of short pieces ready to put on, and he ate the rest of his raspberries. During all that work of the day, his leg had loosened, but it still ached a bit. He rubbed it and watched the fire and thought for the first time since the crash that he might be able to get a handle on things, might be starting to do something other than just sit. He was out of food, but he could look tomorrow and could build a signal fire tomorrow and get more wood tomorrow. The fire cut the night's coolness and settled him back into sleep, thinking of tomorrow. He slept hard and wasn't sure what awakened him, but his eyes came open and he stared into the darkness. The fire had burned down and looked out, but he stirred with a piece of wood and found a bit of coal still glowing hot and red. With small pieces of wood and careful blowing, he soon had a blaze going again. It had been close. He had to be sure to try to sleep in short intervals so he could keep the fire going. And he tried to think of a way to regulate his sleep, but it made him sleepy to think about, and he just was going under again when he heard the sound outside. It was not unlike the sound of the porcupine, something slithering and being dragged across the sand. But when he looked out the door opening, it was too dark to see anything. Whatever it was, it stopped making the sound in a few moments, and he thought he heard something sloshing in the water at the shoreline. But he had the fire now and plenty of wood, so he wasn't as worried as he had been the night before. He dozed, slept for a time, awakened again just at dawn gray light, and added wood to the still smoking fire before standing outside and stretching. Standing with his arms stretched over his head and the tight knot of hunger in his stomach, he looked toward the lake and saw the tracks. They were strange, a main center line from the lake in the sand with claw marks on the side, leading to a small pile of sand, then going back down to the water. He walked over and squatted near them, studied them, tried to make sense of them. Whatever had made the tracks had some kind of flat, dragging bottom in the middle and was apparently pushed along by the legs that stuck out to the side. Up from the water to a small piece of sand, then back down under the water. Some animal, some kind of water animal that came up to the sand. To do what? To do something with the sand. To play and make a pile of sand? He smiled. City boy, he thought. Oh, you city boy with your city ways. He made a mirror in his mind, a mirror of himself, and saw how he must look. City boy, with your city ways, sitting in the sand trying to read your tracks and not knowing, not understanding. Why would anything wild come up from the water to play at the sand? Not that way. Animals weren't that way. They didn't waste time that way. It had come up from the water for a reason. It had a good reason, and he must try to understand the reason. He must change to fully understand the reason himself, or he would not make it. It had come up from the water for a reason, and the reason he thought squatting, the reason had to do with the pile of sand. He brushed the top of gently with his hand, but found only damp sand. There must be a reason, and he carefully kept scraping and digging until about 4 inches down. He suddenly came into a small chamber in the cool, damp sand, and there lay eggs, many eggs, almost perfectly round eggs, the size of table tennis balls, and he laughed then because he knew it had been a turtle. He had seen a show on television about sea turtles that came onto the beaches and laid their eggs in the sand. There must be freshwater lake turtles that did the same thing. Maybe snapping turtles. He had heard of snapping turtles. They became fairly large, he thought. It may have been a snapper that came up in the night when he heard the noise and awakened him. She must have come, then laid the eggs. Food. More than eggs, more than the knowledge, more than anything, this was food. His stomach tightened and rolled and made noise as he looked at the eggs, as if his stomach belonged to somebody else or had seen the eggs with his own eyes and was demanding food. The hunger always there had been somewhat controlled and dormant when there was nothing to eat, but with the eggs came the scream to eat. His body craved food with such intensity that it quickened his breath. He reached into the nest and pulled the eggs out one at a time. There were 17 of them, each as round as a ball and white. They had leathery shells and gave instead of a breaking when he squeezed them. When he had them helped on the sand of the pyramid, he had never felt so rich somehow. He suddenly realized that he did not know how to eat them. He had a fire but no way to cook them, no container, and he had never thought of eating a raw egg. He had an uncle named Carter, his father's brother, who always put an egg in a glass of milk and drank it in the morning. Brian had always watched him do it just once, and when the runny part of the white egg left the glass and went into the uncle's mouth and down the throat in a single gulp, Brian almost lost everything he had ever eaten. Still, he thought, as the stomach moved toward his backbone, he became less and less fussy. Some natives in the world ate grasshoppers and ants, and they could do that. He could eat a raw egg down. He picked one up and tried to break the shell and found it surprisingly tough. Finally, using the hatchet, he sharpened his stick and poked a hole in the egg. He widened the hole with his finger and looked inside. Just an egg. It had a dark yellow yolk and not much white, as he thought there would be. Just an egg, food. Just an egg he had, raw. He looked out across the lake and brought the egg to his mouth and closed his eyes and sucked and squeezed the egg down at the same time and swallowed as fast as he could eat it. Ugh. It had a greasy, almost oily-like taste, but it was still an egg. His throat tried to throw it back up, but his whole body seemed to convulse with it. But his stomach took it, held it, and demanded more. The second egg was easier, and by the third one he had no trouble at all. It just slid down. He ate 6 of them, could have easily eaten all of them, and had not been full, but a part of him said to hold back, save the rest. He could not believe the hunger. The eggs had awakened and fully roaringly so that it tore at him. After the 6th egg, he ripped the shell open and licked the inside clean, and went back and ripped the other 5 open and licked them out as well, and wondered if he could eat the shell. There must be some food value in them, but when he tried, they were too leathery and chewy, so he couldn't get them down. He stood away from the eggs for a moment literally stood and turned away so he could not see them. If he looked at them, he would have to eat more. He would store them in the shelter and eat only once a day. He fought the hunger down again, controlled it. He would take them now and store them and save them and eat one a day. And he realized he thought he had forgotten that they might come. The searchers. Surely they would come before he could eat all the eggs at one a day. He had forgotten to think about them, and that wasn't gone. Good. He had to keep thinking of them because if he forgot them and did not think of them, they might forget about him. And he had to keep hoping. He had to keep hoping. So, chapter 10 was very interesting. Brian had his fire in the night and heard a noise outside and realized that it was actually a turtle laying eggs. And with Brian being so hungry, he actually ate some of the eggs and is now storing them for food for the later days. So, this is the first big discovery that Brian has made for food other than the raspberries. But, good little meal for him, so he's excited about that, but he's still challenged about his rescuers and still having hope for them. So, interesting chapter. We're excited to see what chapter 11 brings us. And until next time, have a good day.